Okay, I think this is on. Hello. So, as I promised on my blog, I'm going to try and answer some questions that people have asked. I still have to work out a few glitches, but I will master this eventually. Okay, so I invited people to ask me questions about evolution, and darn it, they didn't ask the easy ones, like if chickens evolved, why are there still proto-chickens? Oh, but there aren't any. Anyway, so they asked all these really kind of interesting questions. So let's see how well I can do in answering them. So, first question. Someone named John Lee has asked, one thing I have wondered is this: we have a much longer childhood than other mammals. The benefits of this obviously outweigh the drawbacks. Let me stop right there. Do they? I don't know. Have you had children? There's a lot of drawbacks to having children. So, you know, I just would argue with that word, obviously. And I assume that it is an important part of our success as a species. Again, I have to, you know, is it? Can we say that just having a long childhood is advantageous to a species? Because if we could develop really quickly, maybe we'd be more successful. Anyway, set that aside. Let's get to the meat of the question. Why then are there so many bad parents? Why do so many parents harm their children physically or physiologically, psychologically? Why are so many children neglected or ignored by the same animals, their parents, that stand to benefit genetically from the child's successful passage into adulthood? Do other animals have similar behavior, or is it unique to humans? Or is biology not relevant here? Last part is all wrong. Biology is relevant to everything, so we'll just dismiss that. The answer to the question, do other animals have similar behavior, is yes, lots of animals. I mean, infanticide is really common in many species. There's no necessary advantage to protecting your young if, in particular, it would bring you harm and prevent you from producing more progeny. So it's pretty common for organisms to abuse, kill, even eat their children. Yeah, try raising mice sometime. You'll be surprised at how often mom decides to snack on the little babies. So the answer to the question is that why are there so many bad parents is, well, apparently we can survive just fine with a number of bad parents. You know, if we were speaking purely adaptively, we could even say maybe those parents are, in a sense, benefiting themselves by getting rid of this little parasite that is a drag on their life. I don't personally have that attitude, but it's actually, you know, if you've raised children, there's often times when you wonder, why do I keep this thing around? So anyway, that's my answer there. Okay, let's go to another question. Quiet Heretic asks, I have a serious question about evolution, or at least genetics. We know that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes and other apes have 24. Human chromosome 2 is a fusion of two ape chromosomes. Again, you're still apes, but yes, all right. Presumably, this mutation happened in one individual and then spread throughout the population. How can a sperm with 24 chromosomes fertilize an egg with 23 chromosomes, or vice versa? We don't know if the mutant was male or female, so yeah, it could have been the egg that carried that. Wouldn't that have messed up the recombination process during fertilization? And how often would this happen? Have you ever seen organisms with the wrong number of chromosomes for their species? This is a surprisingly common question because people have a little bit of knowledge about meiosis and how you produce gametes, and they don't quite get the big picture. So, first of all, fertilization doesn't involve any kind of pairing or recombination of chromosomes. So this is not a hindrance to fertilization. That's the first important thing. It does matter during meiosis. So having an odd number of chromosomes creates complications during meiosis. But even there, if you've got something like a fusion, you can imagine you got one big chromosome, you got two stumpy little broken chromosomes that can then pair up with it, and it can still carry out meiosis just fine. Is this common? Yes, it's pretty common. If you go through the human population, you can find all kinds of chromosomal abnormalities, rearrangements of the genetic material that generally do not affect the individual at all. They can sometimes cause problems like, for instance, fertilization frequency may be reduced, or they may have reduced numbers of gametes produced. But it just means you have to try harder. And eventually, often, not always, but often, you can produce offspring, even with an abnormal number of chromosomes. Have you ever seen organisms with the wrong number of chromosomes for their species? I don't even know what that means. Organisms with the wrong number of chromosomes for their species. Number of chromosomes for a species is a definitional thing. We do find individuals with variation in chromosomes. The arrangement of your chromosomes is not the basis for your identity, although it can contribute. Okay, third question. This is from somebody with a bunch of weird characters and emojis in their names, but basically their name is usernames, exclamation point, and then figure of something flipping a table labeled misogyny. Okay. When you see it, you can figure it out instantly. The question, why photosynthesis instead of some other energy harvesting process? Is there something about the structure of cyanobacteria that gave it a propensity to develop photosynthesis? Or is photosynthesis an easier way to generate chemical energy for organisms other than anaerobic respiration? Okay, I would say from personal experience, the easiest way to generate energy is by eating something else that has done the work for you. So no, photosynthesis isn't necessarily the easiest way to generate energy. It's what autotrophs do, things that don't need to eat other organisms. Why cyanobacteria and why photosynthesis? Okay, I got to step back a little bit. So if you know your biochemistry and your cell biology, you know that this thing we call photosynthesis is actually two processes. That the first part is an energy harvesting mechanism that gathers light energy and through a series of reactions produces reducing compounds and electrons, basically, and ATP. And that energy from that can then be shuttled into other biosynthetic activities. In particular, the classical way it's taught, but it's not the only way things go, is to say that all that energy is then used to promote the Calvin cycle, which fixes carbon from the atmosphere and uses all those reduced compounds and the ATP to synthesize sugars. This is probably not the original way that things happen. Lots of bacteria carry out the second step, that is the synthesis of organic compounds, without carrying out photosynthesis. So chemoautotrophs, for instance. And actually, it was probably the original mechanism is to harvest energy from other sources than the light. In particular, if we think that life arose in the deep sea, it's kind of dark down there. There wasn't any solar energy or much solar energy available to produce energy. And instead, what we think organisms took advantage of is things like proton gradients. So if you have a difference in acidity, for instance, separated by a membrane, you can get flow of protons or hydrogen ions across the membrane that can then be shackled to produce energy, things like those reduced compounds and ATP that are then used in the synthesis of organic molecules. Photosynthesis is just a handy thing to use, a handy source of energy to harvest it from the sun when you're up there on the surface and when there's reduced availability of things like proton gradients. But ultimately, it's just one additional mechanism that got tacked on to a fundamental mechanism for producing organic compounds. Why did cyanobacteria develop this? Chance, accidents, selection, all that kind of good stuff is going on in these organisms. I'll also point out that if you look in our cells, we are not photosynthetic, but our mitochondria generate proton gradients just like we expect were present at the beginning of life, and use that to produce energy for the cell. I could say something about anaerobic respiration. That also presupposes that sugars were the original energy source, and they weren't. They probably weren't. It took a long, long time for organisms to proliferate and dominate and produce lots of organic compounds that then parasites like us could consume for energy. And then anaerobic respiration becomes important. Lots of organisms don't use oxygen at all for their metabolism. Okay, question number 4. How am I doing so far? Is everything okay? Have I confused you all? Leave comments and let me know if I confused you. Okay, question 4 is from somebody called Big Bappa. My question isn't about evolution so much as basic evolution education. Yeah, okay. With the current installation of Betsy DeAmway into the position of destroyer of public education, I'm very concerned about my grandchildren. I have 2 in school at the moment, 4th grade and 2nd. The 4th grader has begun to show an interest in human origins. I bought him Jared Diamond's book, The Third Chimpanzee, but it seems to be just a little over his head for now. Yeah, okay, that's one problem I found. There's a few good preschooler books. There's a few good high school and college books. Actually, a number of good high school and college books, but that intermediate age, you need some more. I realize this may be out of BZ's wheelhouse, but there are a lot of very smart people reading this blog. Oh yeah, go ahead, go past me, get other people to come. So I'm asking for recommendations for some good books and materials so I can pick up to supplement what I'm afraid he will not be learning at school. Yes, this has been a perennial problem. When I went to school, public school, back in the day, in the Middle Ages, way back when, we never learned anything about evolution. It was kind of disgusting, actually. We just kind of neatly skipped right over anything about evolution. I had to spend a lot of time in the library. As your grandson is doing and having to read books above my reading level in order to figure this stuff out. And I'll be honest, when I was very young, I also got a lot of things that were very wrong because I didn't understand what I was reading. I don't know what to do about this. So we're asking about, what did you say? You said, ooh, 4th grade and 2nd. Oh yeah, that's an awkward age. That's a really young age. You know, there's a couple of approaches to take. One is that focus on the general science, get them excited about here's how you do science, and don't worry so much about evolution just yet, but you will have to get to it later. One thing I would kind of recommend is, you know, there are these 2 old books. There's Darwin's Origin of Species, and there's also Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. And there's a distinction to be made there. Very few people can actually read all the way through Origin of Species because it's kind of dry and repetitive, and it focuses on minutiae. And with my college students, I'll often tell them, Don't bother reading Origin of Species. Also, we've got a lot of new data on that, so it's a little bit obsolete. Read The Voyage of the Beagle instead, because it turns out that that's much more exciting. It's much more accessible. It's talking about, Darwin galloping all over the pampas of South America and exciting things like that. So another thing to do is to focus on books that talk about discovery. When I was that age, I was really into Roy Chapman Andrews. That he's sort of the precursor to Indiana Jones, only he's competent instead of destructive, and he wasn't fighting Nazis. But his expeditions to the Gobi Desert, for instance, make for exciting reading, even if you're not ready to understand the science just yet. Along those same lines, Sean B. Carroll, the biologist, has lately written a whole bunch of books on discovery, basically. What was it? Into the Jungle was one, where he's not so much drilling us on here's how Sonic Hedgehog and Hawk's genes interact and all no, not that stuff. But here are these great discoverers, and here's how they went about the process of figuring out how evolution works. So think about stepping back a little bit, and before you start grilling them on all the complications of molecular evolution, get them thrilled about science first. And then when they get into high school, then you can start throwing stuff at them, like Neil Shubin's Your Inner Fish, I'd recommend. Carl Zimmer's At the Water's Edge. Those are books that also talk about macroevolutionary events, so they're often more easily graspable than talking about molecules bouncing off of each other, or abstract genetics or things like that. But they tell you something about animals evolving. That's also useful. Okay, so maybe some other people have some recommendations for good books for those elementary and middle school kids. I'm useless. I'm sorry. I work with college kids. Okay, next question. A guy named Slatham. He says, okay, Darwin apparently studied and wrote about the intelligence of worms. He wrote about worms, not so much about the intelligence of worms. Okay, but anyway, big question. What would a respectable research program in the evolution of intelligence look like today? I think the operational word there is respectable. First thing you got to do is tell me what intelligence is. It's really hard to measure. And often it's a question that we approach with a whole bunch of biases about how people ought to be thinking, and then we impose those on chimpanzees or dolphins or whatever. But yes, right away this person says, smaller sub-questions, how to measure intelligence. Yeah, that's a problem. IQ is not adequate. IQ is, as has been often said, IQ measures your ability to take IQ tests. So it's not a particularly good measure of intelligence. One of the things we're looking for that we can regard as important with intelligence are things like flexibility and ability to learn and adapt. Adapt on an organismal scale. And there are lots of things that are very intelligent to be able to do that aren't necessarily the same as spending half your life going to college and getting a PhD in some esoteric subject. But okay, so it's a problem. I don't know how to measure it. And I think in a lot of ways it has to be measured in relation to circumstance. Next sub-question. Could brain mass or energy use of the brain be used as a proxy for intelligence or intellectual capacity across evolutionary time or taxa? Right away, there's problems with that, obviously, because brain size varies tremendously and it doesn't seem to correlate very well at all with anything that we would call intelligence. Women, on average, have smaller brains than men, but it's because women are roughly 84, 85% smaller on average than men. So brain size and body size are much more closely correlated than brain size and intelligence. There are efforts to do this sort of thing. You may have heard of something called the encephalization quotient. What that is a measure of brain size relative to expected brain size for an animal of that size. So it takes into account body size. And so basically you get a line that demonstrates here's a rising slope, for instance, with small brain down here and larger brain up here. And it also associates with body size, so it's large bodies over here and small bodies over here. And then what you look for is exceptions. Where are the data points that are above this? Those are smarter or bigger brain than we expect for that body size, or down here, they're smaller brain than we expect. So yeah, things like cows are relatively smaller brains than expected for their body size. And if you know anything about cow intelligence, you kind of say, that makes sense. And then humans, dolphins, chimpanzees, etc., are above that value. But that's about all you can do. What often happens then is you kind of shrug and say, okay, now what? We're confirming our prejudices about the intelligence of these animals. Is that meaningful? Because at the same time, when you look at other organisms, like look at birds. Birds have tiny brains, relatively speaking, but they are amazingly intelligent. You look at Steller's jays or crows, they're much smarter than you would think. I would expect that a crow could beat a squirrel, for instance, in any kind of intellectual competition. And when you look at the structure of their brains, they're interesting. They're differently structured than our brains. They're more, neurons are a bit denser. So brain size gets really complicated. So then he goes on, should intelligence be scrapped for the study of some brain parameters that we can better define and measure, like maybe a range of behavior? That I would kind of agree with, that trying to reduce intelligence to just bulk quantities of neural material is difficult, because I think there's so many other parameters that affect this. And so what we do is we look at an indirect parameter, what's producing all that intelligence, and that's things like behavior. So ethologists should be doing more work on this, and they are doing lots of work on this. So but they don't go into it with a preconception that they understand exactly what intelligence is, or that brain size affects it. This guy just keeps going. There's another part of this question. How does education, broadly defined, relate to intelligence or brain capacity or range of behavior or whatever in an evolutionary sense? Like if some dolphin species spends more time teaching offspring a lot of behaviors in the wild, what could be inferred about their brains relative to another species that spends less time? And how to test that inference? You guys, you keep asking me these gigantic immense questions. This is hard. This was supposed to be easy. Well, but okay. But that is a good point. So how does education relate to intelligence? It relates a lot. That it's clear that children who get better educational opportunities do better, are better masters of most intellectual activities than children who are deprived of educational opportunities. So in that sense, yeah, education is all important in all this. At the same time, of course, there's biological constraints. So there are probably people with more limited capacities or greater capacities, but how well you take advantage of that is going to be most predominantly affected by your education. Then the more narrow question, like if a dolphin species spends more time teaching offspring, could we test that? You'd have to have, it's difficult to work with dolphin species because often they're endangered, they're huge, they require large amounts of space. Maybe we shouldn't do experiments on dolphins. Just throwing that out there. What would be more interesting is, let's look at flies, for instance. No one cares if you squash a fly. You can make lots of them and you can do experiments to test their intelligence. And those kinds of experiments are done all the time. And there have been found, for instance, that there are some mutants that affect their ability to learn or adapt to novel circumstances. I would think that would be a better strategy. But then, of course, flies are great for looking at education. Not so great for genetics, but not so great for looking at education. How do you educate a fly? Yeah, you have to put them into a narrow training regimen, and that probably doesn't compare really well to broad-based educational methods. So yeah, once again, you've hit me with a hard question. Okay, I'll move on. I'll go to the next question. Next question is from James Bertoff, who prefixes it by saying he's a longtime stalker, first-time commenter. Okay. What can I do to see evolution happen? I don't have a lab, a biology degree, or any specialist training, but I've always kind of assumed that if I can get some sort of population of some sort of creature with a short lifespan and introduce some sort of gradually increasing pressure to the population, but I don't know, can I, using not too expensive materials available from the internet or otherwise easy to obtain, create a new species that is visually distinct from their parent? Okay, you're biasing a little bit towards morphology, but all right. Visually, because numbered among the massive list of equipment I don't have is a way of looking at DNA. Is that a realistic goal, and where should I start? Yeah, it's really easy. Farmers have been doing this. Dog breeders, look at your dogs. They've been the product of evolution. But yeah, there's lots of things you can do. For instance, one experiment I did with my daughter many years ago, just because it was pretty easy to do, is we didn't get very far. She was a student. She was an middle school student, so there was limits that we could do. But the idea is sound. We were looking at fruit flies, because fruit flies are easy and cheap and they breed really fast. That's something, if you want to see it within your lifetime, you need something that will breed fairly quickly. And we were looking at sensitivity to alcohol. It's a really easy experiment. We built an alcohol testing chamber, which is basically a cardboard tube, long cardboard tube that went up, and we had these alternating baffles like so. And what you do is you put a bunch of flies at the top, and you put a little container of alcohol so the fumes just waft up. Flies tend to be really sensitive to alcohol. And what happens is that as the fumes waft up, the flies that are sensitive to alcohol pass out and fall down through the baffles. The flies that are not can fly around quite a bit. So you can get this whole range of responses where some flies don't care, they're up here at the top. There are flies that are totally unconscious that have been caught in the baffles. And you can pull out sensitive flies and alcohol-resistant flies, the good drinkers versus the easy wimps who pass out with the first sip. And you can actually separate out your flies into these different strains. And then you can breed them. And like I said, we didn't get very far. We got the initial experiment set up, and we got some things going. It was good enough for her to do a science fair with it. But then you could do multiple generations of that. Start breeding for alcohol resistance. And you can end up, after a number of generations, this stuff has been published, after a number of generations, you can end up with flies that can drink all the other flies under the table, and other flies that they get a whiff of alcohol and they just drop dead. Now, that's not morphology, that's behavior, it's sensitivity to environmental perturbations, things like that. But that's the general principle, and it's pretty easy to do, and it happens all the time, which makes it surprising. Why are there so many creationists? Because you can test these things out all the time. They've been done routinely and published, and it really, really works. Of course, the answer to that question is that the creationists will look at it, but it's still a fly, and then you have to slap them. No, we're not encouraging violence. Metaphorical slapping, okay. All right, let's go to another question. DHA Becker asks some questions on evolution. Is there a known correlation between the number of individuals in any species and the rate of change? Bacteria versus humans, say. Does rate of change vary depending on the size of an individual in a species? Bacteria versus elephants. Or is it lifespan of an individual species? Did God create creation t-shirts? No, this is my, oh, I can't show you that. It's Darwin, not Darwin. God did not make that. He probably struck the person who did make it dead, but okay. So, a whole bunch, oh, the last question, are all 4 questions equally stupid? Yes, they are. No, equally intelligent, shall we put it that way? So, is there a known correlation between the number of individuals of any species and the rate of change? There are a number of parameters that we measure when we're looking at rate of change. For example, one common one is to ask the probability of fixation of a new allele in a population. And yes, there is a pretty clear-cut correlation. There's an inverse correlation between the probability of fixation, that is, that gene becoming widespread throughout the entire population, and the size of the population. So small populations will fix a gene more rapidly than large populations. Okay, so that's kind of the answer there is, yeah, if you want to see rapid changes in the frequency of alleles, smaller populations are better at that than big populations. So yeah, bacteria versus humans. Humans are a tiny population compared to bacteria. Of course, the trade-off there is that if you've got a large population, then selection can see those traits and test them more thoroughly. So you're more likely to get strong selection in a large population. Does the rate of change vary depending on the size of an individual or lifespan? I think is a more appropriate one. Yeah, so another of the parameters is generation time. And obviously bacteria, which have generation times from 20 minutes to hours to days, are going to be able to reproduce much more rapidly than elephants with generation times of decades, like humans. So, sure, yeah, the little guys are going to out-evolve us in a sense. That this is one of our challenges with emerging diseases, is that bacteria will be able to outpace us. We can develop new techniques for combating bacteria, infectious bacteria, but the bacteria will have so many generations that evolution can get to work and help them evade that. Okay, let's go to the next question. From Monad, I know genes are much more shaped by drift than by selection, but then that's not particularly surprising because most genes don't seem like their variants would change that much about the organism anyway. Okay, but I think this person has some prior knowledge because once upon a time, like before the 1960s, people would have been surprised at the extent of variation. It took some hard work to discover that populations are natural reservoirs of gigantic amounts of variation, which created problems for a purely selectionist view of evolution. I'd be interested to know how often features are selected. Things like the appearance of stripes, the particular structure of a limb, etc. My guess is that that's much too vaguely defined to have any answer. Yes, you get a prize, that's correct. But maybe you know a more useful version. No, I take the prize back. I don't know a more useful version. This is another one of those really hard questions. How do you assess novelties appearing in a population? Because some of them are going to disappear. If you suddenly sprout an extra limb in one of your children, that's most likely going to vanish. It's probably not genetically controlled anyway. How do you assess novelty and features appearing? And so he's asking about things like limbs and so forth. About the only way I know to actually look at this is to look at the fossil record. So paleontologists are kind of the experts here when we can document over long periods of time great amounts of variation in species. We also document limits, like there are no terrestrial animals that have not animals, terrestrial vertebrates that have 6 limbs. There's something in our makeup that just says, okay, that's a really hard problem. So there's a limit to what variations can exist. On the other hand, we do know from the fossil record that in the early years of tetrapods, there was a great deal of variation in digit number. So 5 is now canonical, but it wasn't always there. There were 13 fingered animals and so forth. So again, though, if you've got some ancient tetrapod with 13 fingers that went extinct, and all the extant species have a base number of 5, secondarily using some and so forth, how do you count? Do we count each species as a slightly different number, or is that just saying, okay, they're really sloppy in regulating digit number? I don't know. This is a tough one. There is a fair amount of work done on the evolution of novelties. Oh, there was a paper just this last year. There was a paper by Douglas Irwin in 2015. Maybe what I'll do is I'll give myself a homework assignment and I'll summarize that paper for you. So would that help? So I can't answer it on the spot. But anyway, there's a huge amount of discussion in evolutionary biology about some of our assumptions, like, is most of the novelty, the variation, driven by the environment? So you've got fitting of organisms to optimal niches in their environment, which would mean that what defines the amount of novelties you see is environmental change. So if environments are changing rapidly, you'll get more novelties. And then there's another school of thought that says, no, it's not just evolution, that there's a lot of churn, a lot of change for the sake of change. And a lot of variation is not directly adaptive, although it may construct an adaptive role for itself. Construction is another magic word in evolutionary biology, which I really, I don't have time to go into it all. Anyway, okay. He has another part of this question. Also not directly about evolution, except in that all biology is shaped by it, but possibly still in your area is the first few steps of embryonic development. There has been lots written about how things like Hox factors trigger differentiation in the front and back, different limbs and organs, and so on. But what controls the basic arrangement of cells? For instance, the difference between spiral and radial cleavage. How do they know which direction to divide? Oh, that's a good question too. That's an old question. Oh, this is no mystery. People have been asking this for, what, 150 years and trying to figure this stuff out. Things like spiral cleavage is where an organism, the one cell divides into 2 and then 4, and then at the 8-cell stage, it divides into a top tier of cells, but that top tier is rotated some amount of degrees, so you get kind of a spiral pattern of cells emerging. And of course, that's really specifically regulated by all kinds of interesting mitotic machinery. You can also see these in things like, we had a guest lecture just recently talking about Siona, the Ascidian. They also have a very stereotyped pattern of early cell division, and they also have precisely oriented mitotic spindles that cause these specific divisions. Even in Drosophila, there was something. Yeah, there's lots of stuff about regulation of mitotic spindles to control orientation. Drosophila has some of that, but not as much as, for instance, nematodes. It's very specific. Ascidians, it's really specific. All those spiral cleavage things like mollusks, it's very specific. That is a predisposition often imposed by maternal factors. So when mom produces the egg, she orients everything. There's also some contribution from sperm entry, which is a rather dramatic shift in membrane polarity. For instance, it induces that can align things. You're also asking about controlling basic arrangement of cells, like spiral and radial cleavage, how they know which direction to divide. Lots of things are affected by the external environment. I just mentioned sperm entry point. So, for instance, in our zebrafish, sperm entry point is one of the things that helps contribute to the definition of dorsal and ventral. In some plants, for example, plants are a good example of this. It's light. The light shining down on the little gamete or zygote specifies an orientation so that it will divide in a particular way. But there's a huge amount of literature on this. Just thinking, there's a book by Jonathan Slack, This End Up, I think it's called. It's all about orientation, so that's something you can look at. Okay, just 2 more questions. I should check just in case somebody has thrown up a question on my site. You never know. Let's see. Oh, they're ignoring me. No, they're too busy listening attentively to what I say. Okay, so 2 more questions and I'll let you all go, and I'll go too. Jack Sprocket asks, I am told that most of the cells in my body aren't human, or at best, it's a Trump majority. No, it's not a Trump majority. It's clearly definite that there's a majority of cells in your body that are not of directly human origin. So, you know, nothing like a Trump majority. Yes, this distinction is real and legitimate, unlike our president. Okay. Whether that's true or only a big proportion of our cells are non-human doesn't matter much. Okay, they're a big factor. And I assume that's the same for all other complex life. It's true sort of for even simple life, simple cell life. There's environmental associations between different species all the time. You know, they don't have guts, of course, so it's not that way, but look into biofilms, for instance. There's a lot of work being done on interactions between different organisms that affect how they operate metabolically, genetically, and all that kind of good stuff. So my Darwin Day question is, how big a factor in evolution is the ecosystem that complex organisms host? So how big a factor is all this stuff growing in my guts? And how do I answer that? It's big. It's really big. It's huge. It's tremendous. You'd be dead without them. So yeah, of course it makes a huge difference. Are you looking for a number? Because I can't give you a number on that. 99%. All right, whatever. But yeah, of course it matters a great deal. That we are reliant for a lot of our nutritional processing on those gut bacteria. Ask a microbiologist and they will tell you all kinds of stories about the role of these gut bacteria in your everyday physiology. So sure, you could imagine that there's all kinds of things that could happen here. You also know from personal experience, if something traumatically affects the distribution of your gut bacterial species, it has dramatic effects on your larger scale physiology. So yeah, go eat some bad Mexican food and then report back and tell me, does this affect my adaptive situation in this environment? I think you'll say yes. I mean, then give me a number. 99% again, okay. All right, let's go for one last question, and this one will be loads of fun because this one comes from a creationist. I could just throw this away. No, okay. I also put up on Talk Origins a request to say, yeah, you could ask me questions here even. And Ray Martinez jumped in, and if you know Talk Origins, he's a loquacious idiot who inhabits Talk Origins, just babbles incessantly. And then, of course, after he chimes in, everyone's busy beating up on Ray rather than bringing up interesting questions. But okay, that's That's talk origins culture for you. So here's his question. Doesn't the wondrous complexity found in nature and universe logically indicate design and not accident or chance? Yeah, we've heard this before. Atheists have no choice, my friend. They must believe in accident and chance because in their minds, no God exists to cause anything to exist. So profound, so profoundly stupid. Okay, so let's try and answer this seriously. Doesn't the wondrous complexity found in nature suggest design? No, it doesn't. Why would you assume that? Uh, a multiplicity of parts can also arise by chance, and then they're shaped by necessity. I don't think he understands that phrase, chance and necessity, but I'm talking to you, my audience, who is much more intelligent, that all this complexity can arise by other mechanisms that don't involve design. I like to point out that, if you talk to an engineer who's really doing design, the kinds of Rube Goldberg apparatus that exists in our cells are not considered optimal strategies for design. Designers try to pare things down, make it simple and clean and functional. What you find in evolution is this agglomeration of parts to try to accomplish a specific end, or often not even a specific end. Everything is interlinked and overlapping and working together. It doesn't sound like design at all to me. So using the phrase wondrous doesn't help things. Yeah, if we're not here, there's nothing to wonder at it. So complexity is the operational word here, and complexity does not specify a designer. He then goes on with this atheist thing. They have no choice. They must believe in accident and chance. We believe in accident and chance because we can measure those. We can actually go out and assess variation. I'm teaching a genetics class right now, and the first thing we do, first day of lab, is an exercise in probability and statistics and measuring chance variation and all this kind of stuff. So it's not because we don't believe in God. I suspect most of my students are actually believers in God. It's not something I ask them. But it's because we can operationally and mechanically and routinely, mathematically measure this stuff. And so we know that accident and chance occur. It's not all predetermined. As for that part about because in their minds no God exists to cause anything to exist, once more we get into this infinite regress. Okay, you say you need a God to make everything else exist. Then if that's true, we need something else to make God exist, because God is obviously a complex being. And do not chicken out on me and say, no, he's really simple, because he's not, he can't be. To create an entire universe. Yeah. And if he's really simple, then we can reduce him to just the chance processes that operate in the universe. We don't need some kind of conscious entity. Once you've got a conscious entity, you get something that's pretty complicated. But anyway, if you're going to argue it, we can just get into an infinite regress argument. No, that just doesn't work. Okay. Are we done? I think we're done. Was this fun? Let me know. And maybe I'll do it again sometime, collect some other questions and see how it works. And with that, I will stop now and I will go do my teaching preparation for tomorrow. Talk to you later.